Hello, welcome. Over the past few months, I have been reading the Nebula Award nominees for full novels. Now, the Nebula Awards award the best in science fiction and fantasy as nominated by science fiction and fantasy writers and other people in like the professional book scene. So all of these were nominated by other authors and they're all voted on by other authors. The Nebula Awards actually are being streamed tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and I'm here to tell you about the books that were nominated, so you don't have to read them if you don't want to. I'm also going to make predictions about who I think is going to win. But first, we're going to go through the books, and I am going through them in the order that I read them. We are starting out with 10,000 Doors of January, which I read last year. And I am going to give you flashbacks of a different me, where I am talking about these books as I read them, with the exclusion of 10,000 Doors of January, but all of the other ones is like a few days after I had actually read the book, so we were getting a little bit more of a fresh take on it. So first up, 10,000 Doors of January. So technically speaking, the first Nebula Awards finalist that I read was 10,000 Doors of January by Alix Harrow, and I read this last year, and I believe I finished it on Christmas Eve, and this was the 11th place book in the Goodreads Choice Awards for fantasy. I ended up reading it because I just happened to have it from Book of the Month Club. So I was like, yeah, why not? I'll read the 11th place book. Unfortunately for this book, I read it soon after finishing The Starless Sea. And it has a very similar premise to The Starless Sea. This just isn't as good. I said at the time of recording that video that this I felt was going to be a very forgettable book, and I was right. I don't really remember a whole lot about it. I do know the main character's name is January, and there are doors all over our world that lead to other worlds that may or may not be similar to our world, but a corporation basically goes through finding these doors, going through stealing magical objects, and then destroying the doors so no one else can visit these other lands. And January finds these doors and starts finding out about it. I'm gonna put a spoiler thing on the screen right here because I'm gonna spoil some stuff. If you're not interested in hearing about spoilers, then fast forward until that's off the screen. But basically, January's father is from another one of these worlds and got trapped with January in our world, while her mother is from our world and got trapped in her father's world. And her father is working for this company, finding magical objects and trying to find a door to his world and go back to the love of his life, January's mother. While he is doing this, January is living with a very wealthy man who is part of this conglomerate who is trying to shut down all of these doors once they can't profit on it off of them anymore. Overall, it's an okay story. I didn't have anything, there wasn't wrong with it. It just wasn't a memorable story, not something that I really felt a connection to. I didn't feel a connection to any of the characters. It was just kind of a It's fine. The next book that I read was A Song of a New Day by Sarah Pinsker, and before I cut to me talking about this, I do want to point out that the parallels in this book are eerily similar to the self-isolation and social distancing that we are experiencing right now. When I had read this book, COVID-19 we knew about, but it hadn't really affected the United States yet. This was something that was still coming out of China, and at the time that I was reading it, it was kind of a big deal in Korea, and global travel was kind of not recommended to a lot of places, but nothing had stopped or shut down. So the way I talk about it might not be entirely up to date with how we feel about this now. And unfortunately, this was a really, really wonderful book, but I'm afraid a lot of people aren't going to want to read it because they're experiencing this book right now. And usually, like, science fiction is an escape, not a, holy shit, this is exactly my life and this is where our future is going. So I'm going to cut to past me, and just keep in mind that this was recorded in late February, so the situation has changed a little bit since I recorded this. This one is very interesting because it just doesn't have a lot of reviews on Goodreads. It's a very, very low reviewed book, which means a lot of people haven't heard of it. And honestly, that's really sad because this book was fantastic. This is dystopian sci-fi, and it is scarily relevant to like current society. It starts in what I would consider modern times, where gathering places like hotels, concerts, movie theaters, stadiums, schools, just wherever you can find large gatherings of people start getting targeted by bomb threats and or actual bombs and or active shooters, which we're seeing things like that. Lots of people start dying in these situations, and the government overall recommends that people stay at home as much as they can and try not to get into situations where they're in large groups of people. In the midst of these bombings and shootings, a disease shows up. It's a pox-like disease that causes open wounds, very similar to chickenpox, except for the scarring's much worse, and it has a high chance of killing you. And this pox wipes out a very vast majority of the population. With these like horrors, human contact is just really not recommended at all, and everything that we do publicly is shifted online with a big emphasis on working from home and then like 3D entertainment. So there are two perspectives in the first part of the book, and it's two different timelines. One is modern for us, and the other one is a futuristic after this plague has kind of died down a bit. And both main characters are female and both of them are queer. In the modern setting, Luce is the main character. She is the lead singer of a band that has just now hit like popularity, like mainstream popularity, and she is on tour. She is the last person to ever play a live concert of time up to this point. She will be the last to ever play a live concert. And then you are in her point of view as the world as we know it ends. Then The second point of view is from a young lady named Rosemary, who was very young, like preteens or maybe even like 8 or 9, when the main events of the world ending took place. She is an adult now in her early 20s, working for Super Wally. Yeah, it's really called Super Wally, which is this huge conglomerate of warehouse stores that's kind of like a mix between Walmart and Amazon, where it's all done through drone deliveries, but it's where the vast majority of people in the world shop, and you just have it drone delivered to your house, so you never actually have to leave your house. She does customer service for like partners of Super Wally. So Super Wally's like the distributor, but a lot of companies sell through their systems, and she does customer service for them, fixing like back-end bugs and things like that. And she is asked to attend an online 3D concert to troubleshoot, even though it's really just like a free gift for thanking her for helping. It's disguised as, we need your help troubleshooting this, because she can't accept free gifts, right? And from there she kind of like falls in love with the music industry and concerts, and then pursues a job in the music industry as a recruiter instead of just the basic customer service that she's been doing up to this point. But as a recruiter, she has to go out and be around people. She has to go to public places and illegal public gatherings and see this talent live in order to recruit them. And it's something that she's like, being around people is something she's never done in her entire life. So that leads us to part 2, where it is now everything is caught up to the futuristic time, and Rosemary and Luce meet up with each other in a underground music club. And this section gets a lot more political, where while the government has kind of stopped people gathering for a good reason, the fact that it is still illegal to gather when all of these fears are kind of gone. The sickness has been cured, no one catches it anymore, there's no real threats of bombings anymore, but it's still illegal to gather in public places. And it's now just used as a form of control. So this is a very political section, and there's a lot of character growth and building for Rosemary, being an ignorant child going out into a new world from what she's experienced. And then part 3 is a continuation of this like political idea, where Luce and Rosemary go their separate ways and fight the system from different points of view, where Luce is just ignoring the laws and traveling all over the world, playing rock concerts when they're illegal, and then Rosemary is trying to fight the system from within. Overall, this is a really, really good book. I liked the first part much better than I liked the politically based parts, but they were still like very, very enjoyable. And I'm not somebody who particularly cares one way or another about music. Music is the subject matter in the book, but not the purpose of the book. So like Daisy Jones and the Six, you can read and enjoy this story without having any sort of enjoyment for concerts, rock music, or anything like that. It's just a really interesting reflection on what could happen based off of events that we are currently going through. I highly recommend that anybody who likes science fiction, especially post-apocalyptic science fiction, check out this book. This was an easy 4 stars for me, and I really liked it. But like I said, it doesn't have like any reviews on Goodreads. When I'm recording this, it has like 560 reviews, which is nothing compared to a lot of the more popular books of the last year. So highly recommend go out and read it. The next book up is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martin. This book, unfortunately, was never set up to be a success to me. This is a sci-fi space opera, and that is by far the least, or the type of sci-fi that I like the least. For those of you who aren't super familiar with sci-fi and don't know what a space opera is, a space opera is kind of like a high fantasy where the author has created an entirely new world that has no premise on our own, except for it takes place in outer space instead of being fantasy. So this takes place on a planet known as Caine, I think. It's a very Aztec-y looking sort of word, and I'm probably going to butcher a lot of the names in here just because I don't know how to pronounce them. But this takes place on a central planet in an empire where the people are an alien race. They're human-like, but not necessarily human as we know it. There is no Earth or anything like that in this world. And Mahit is a ambassador to this world from a space station. She grew up on a spaceship floating in space, was completely raised there, and it's a completely different experience than growing up on a planet. But she has learned the language and grown up to be with the goal to be an ambassador to this planet because she is very in love with their culture. They do some really cool stuff in here. Like, the language of this planet is spoken like poetry. So a lot of spoken word poetry, a lot of allusion, a lot of metaphor, and that's how they communicate with each other. So the better you are at creating poetry, the more powerful you are in politics or like social popularity. She is being sent there because her predecessor died from supposedly an allergic reaction. Supposedly. I'm not going to spoil if that was actually an allergic reaction, but there's a lot of questions of like, he's been on this planet for like 30 years and he suddenly has an allergic reaction. You have to figure out like the society and the lore and everything like that as you go. So it's not something where it's going to explain everything to you. The author, I think, is in love with this poetic language, and a lot of what you're reading is unnecessarily large words that aren't commonplace in the English language. So you may have to do a lot of lookups, definitions for words, things that you might just not be familiar with. And I think that is a testament to the fact that the author wants to create this poetic, flowery language. So Mahit is, as I said earlier, an ambassador from the space station, and the space station has created a technology where people get the memories and personality of their predecessors implanted in the back of their heads, and it helps cultivate memories and experience, so they're better able to run this space station. You basically end up blending your personality into another person's personality. You're not like a person who has like a completely separate voice in the back of your head. It starts that way, but over time everything kind of blends together and you create a new personality between the AI that is installed in the back of your head and your own personality. And you have to be compatible personalities, and there's a lot of tests and a lot of like restrictions on doing something like this. But it is a technology that they have invented. And the Caine emperor and some of his higher ups have kind of discovered this technology and want to use it to basically live forever. He wants to create a clone of himself and have this technology installed in his clone, so when his body dies, he basically just moves to this new body and continues to rule forever. And this is a very political book, and it goes about the politics and scheming and stuff like that based on this warlike empire and a dying emperor and what he wants to do to live forever versus what other factions who want to take over in his place. If you like politics and space operas, you will probably really like this book. I don't like politics or space operas, so it was a very hard struggle for me to get through, but I still didn't hate the book. Like, this is a 3-star book. It just had a lot not going for it as far as my reading taste are concerned. So I imagine that if you actually like the content of what's in this book, you'll really, really like this book. It's just not for me. I forgot to say that there is queer representation in this book. There are both male-male and female-female couples, so if that's something that makes you more interested to read a book, then there you go. Next, I read Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn and Muir, and right on the cover explains the heart of this story. This is lesbian necromancers explore a haunted gothic palace in space. So, sci-fi on a new planet with lesbian necromancers. That should sell it, like, instantly right there. This is one of the most unique concepts that I've read in a long time, and it was actually, like, amazingly good. It sounds kind of like a funny, like, meme-y type of premise to have lesbian space necromancers, but the story of this is so incredibly good. You have Gideon, who is this lovely lady on the front of the cover. She basically fell to, I was gonna say Earth, but it's a different planet. There are 9 planets in this universe, and each planet is ruled by a house. Gideon fell to the 9th planet with her mother, which is a very religious necromantic planet, and all of the planets are necromancers in some way. This one is particularly good at raising armies of bone. And Gideon basically showed up with her mother. Her mother was dead. Gideon was in her arms, and they don't know where she came from, so she was kind of adopted into the family. And something happened when Gideon was very, very young, where all of the children on this planet died of a freak accident. And Gideon, a young boy, were the only 2 to survive. And since then, there has only been 1 child born on the planet, and her name is Harrow. And this story is about Gideon and Harrow, who basically hate each other. They, like, absolutely hate each other. Harrow is the daughter of the queen and king, and she is a necromancer. Gideon is not actually a necromancer. She is she's a blades master, and she is enlisted to be Harrow's protector, even though they absolutely hate each other. And Harrow and a representative from every single house across this universe has to go to the first house and compete to kind of serve the emperor. It's very sci-fi and convoluted and kind of hard to explain in a summary. But Gideon goes with Harrow to help her get through these trials and kind of protect her from the sabotage of the other houses. And adventures happen. Gideon is, the whole story is kind of told from her perspective, like in her mind, and she is such an amazing, like, sarcastic, like, fuck everybody type of character. She just wants to lay around, look at titty magazines, and fight people with her two-handed sword. She doesn't really fit in with, like, the royalty and everything like that, but she doesn't give a shit. She just wants her titty magazines and her sword. But this was just an honestly, like, super fantastic book. The second book in the series, Harrow the Ninth, I think is what it's called, comes out later this year, and I have it on pre-order because I am super, super excited to read it. This one is like a heavy 5 stars for me. This is probably one of the best books I've read all year, so I highly, highly, highly recommend this to anybody, not only because it's so much fun and so amusing, but because the story is, like, actually good and heartwarming and completely amazing, and I loved it. Highly recommend. Next, I read Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Now, this book has one of the most interesting concepts I've heard in a long time. It takes place in the 1920s in Mexico City and involves a young girl who's kind of a Cinderella character. Her mother married a man who her father did not approve of, and they ran away, had a child, and then the man died young, and the main character and her mother were forced to go back to her grandfather to be cared for because it's the 1920s. Women just really can't look after themselves. Not only is it the 1920s, it's the 1920s in Mexico, which is even less progressive than the United States. They live in a very small town, and Cassiopeia, who is the main character, is kind of forced to slave away taking care of her family. Now, Cassiopeia discovers bones in a chest in her grandfather's bedroom, and the bones turned out to belong to a Mayan god of death. And Cassiopeia has to go on an adventure with the Mayan god of death to restore him to his proper power. He was killed, or temporarily killed. They're gods of death, so it's kind of actually hard to kill a god of death. But he was dispatched by his twin brother, I think they're twins, maybe younger brother, who wanted to be the ruling god in his stead. And the concept of this book sounds so incredibly interesting, like Mayan gods in the 1920s. Like, what's not to love about that? Unfortunately, the execution of this book just didn't really do anything for me. It was very bland, very predictable, very boring, and it was super disappointing given how interesting it should have been with the concept, and the execution was just kind of like, eh. Honestly, every single thing in this book was predictable. You have the stereotypical bad guy, kind of like the Draco Malfoy character, who doesn't really have any motivation to be as horrible as he is. He's just that way. And then you have the two gods who don't really care about anything human, but the young heroine is going to bring out human emotions of love in the main character god, and it's boring, and I was really, really disappointed by the execution of this book. There are better books out there if you're looking for Mayan stories. I read one last year called, let me look it up. It's called The Seven Sons by Lanny Ford. It's actually really, really good if you're looking for Mayan mythology or like fantasy Mayan. I think that one's way better than this one, and that's the one I would recommend if that's something you're looking for. I don't know that I really recommend this to anybody. It just felt extremely mediocre to me. It wasn't bad. There's just better things out there to read. The last book nominated for the Nebula Awards is a book called The Marque of Caine, but it's the 5th book in a series, and I ain't got time for that. I really don't have time for that. So what I decided to do instead is read the first book of the series, so I can at least get kind of a feel for what the series is. And the first book in the series is a book called Fire with Fire. It's by Charles E. Gannon, and this was actually nominated for a Nebula Award in 2014. It was published in 2013. Now, this book, described in one sentence, is James Bond in space, complete with the sexism. It feels like it was written in the 1990s, not 2013. It really, really just feels like a James Bond novel, but set in outer space instead of Earth. The main character is perfect, where he can't do anything wrong. He always has the right answer. He's the person everybody looks to solve the situation. That doesn't particularly bother me to have a perfect character, but I know it does bother a whole lot of people. All the characters are very one-dimensional. They're very flat. There's no character growth. There's no any real dimension to them, honestly. The writing is very misogynistic. But it's misogynistic in a way that like didn't personally bother me. I entirely understand the idea of wanting to put yourself in a fantasy where maybe you're not so attractive and you write a character who is you, but whatever the opposite sex or whatever the sex that is or you're attracted to throws themselves at you. So in this case, it's a male author who is writing a perfect man scenario and every woman wants him. It's misogynistic, but like I said, I get it. Like, it doesn't bother me. There's no rapey scenes or anything like that. There's no real romance in it. It's just every woman in this book is a powerful woman until she comes in contact with the main character, and then she just wants to throw herself at him and he's going to save her, and she suddenly becomes a damsel in distress. It's a kind of a whatever situation for me where it's problematic, but I don't care. The plot's pretty disjointed. It feels like 2, maybe 3 completely different books shoved into one novel. And it's got a completely different vibe from all of the other books on this list. It doesn't make any sense for this book, even in 2014, when we're talking about the actual nomination of this book. Like, I don't understand why this book is up for any sort of award. The writing's not great. It's very generic. All of the tropes are generic. All the characters are generic. The characters are one-dimensional. This is not doing anything new. Why is this up for an award? This was done in the 1980s and 1990s why is this up for award in 2014? And why is this continuously up for award in 2020 for the 5th book in the series of generic space spy sagas? And I understand, like, how I'm talking right now, you'd think that I didn't like this book. I liked it. It was very, like, trash candy to me, where there's no depth to this, and so it was a really easy, fun read where I knew exactly what was going to happen. The hero won at the end of the day, everything turns out great, but why is this up for an award? I don't know. It was an easy 3 stars for me, I liked it, but I don't know. Now that you've heard about the books that I've read and my thoughts on them, it's time for me to make my predictions. Now, if we were going based off of the book that I liked the most, I think Gideon the Ninth would win. I would want Gideon the Ninth to win, but I don't actually think it's going to win. What I do think is going to win is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martin. This is a very classic science fiction space opera that is amazingly well written, but modernized. And as far as literary goes, this is the best book, literary-wise, on this list. There's 3 books that I question their presence on this list entirely. The Marquis of Caine, like, the whole series is so dated. I also don't think it's going to win because I don't think a lot of authors are going to take the time to catch up on this series if they haven't already been reading this series. And it's dated. At least the first book in the series was. I'm going to assume that the tropes of the series continue to stay dated. And I'm not impressed with the writing on this one. 10,000 Doors of January is also a very weird choice for me because I didn't like this. It was the same basic story as The Starless Sea, but The Starless Sea did this a million times better. Why is The Starless Sea not on this list? Why take the lesser of the 2 books? And then the other one was Gods of Jade and Shadow. I kind of understand why this is on the list because it was just so different. It was a completely new premise, but again, the characters are flat. The characters are one-dimensional. And the writing was predictable and boring. The idea was really good. The execution of the idea just fell so short for me. So that's my thoughts. If you've read any of these books, tell me down below if your opinion of them is different than mine, and let me know who you think is going to win and why it's A Memory Called Empire. And I will see you in the next video.